Hello and welcome to another making of video. This time we're taking a look at my newest short film, Choices, an anaglyph film. What does anaglyph mean? Well, in order to understand that, we need to take a look into the history of 3D movies. If you know me, you know that I love 3D. Whether it be the 3D boom of the 50s with films like Creature from the Black Lagoon, to the 80s cheesy gimmicky 3D movies like Friday the 13th Part 3 or Jaws 3D, to the most recent boom of the early 2010s with films like Avatar and Hugo. I love 3D. But what does anaglyph mean? Well, anaglyph by definition is a stereoscopic photograph with the two images superimposed and printed in different colors, producing a stereo effect when the photograph is viewed through correspondingly colored filters. But in layman's terms, this is the red and cyan 3D glasses that have become synonymous with 3D. The type of 3D glasses that you get now in the theater are actually polarized 3D, and believe it or not, that has been the standard since the 50s. Because I'm a millennial, I grew up with films like Spy Kids 3D and Shark Boy and Lava Girl, which were anaglyph, creating the misconception that anaglyph was the standard until the 2000s, which is just not true. If you want to know more about the history of 3D, I highly recommend checking out the 3D Film Archive. That will be linked below in the description. There's another misconception that the first ever 3D movie was 1952's Buona Devil, but 3D has been a part of film ever since the beginning.
When films were first created, three things were expected and looked forward to and experimented with. That was sound, color, and 3D. And you can go back to the very beginnings of film, and you'll see examples of that, people trying constantly.
The first 3D film was actually a film called The Power of Love from 1922, produced by Harry K. Farrell and directed by both Farrell and Nat G. Deverich. But the film utilized a red and green anaglyph system in a two-camera, two-projector stereoscopic format developed by both Farrell and Robert F. Elder. What you're seeing now is actually the camera that was used to film The Power of Love. Unfortunately, both the 3D version and the 2D version, which was renamed Forbidden Lover, are believed to be lost with only a few still frames remaining. Now, to relate this back to Choices, The Power of Love also did something very interesting. It allowed you to view two different endings depending on which lens you looked through, the tragic or the happy ending. As you can assume, this was part of my inspiration to have two storylines happening simultaneously, where the viewer gets to choose which storyline to follow by choosing which color lens to view the film through. Now, The Power of Love wasn't my only inspiration for Choices, as this technique was later used in a similar but different way in 1960 with William Castle's gimmicky cult classic, 13 Ghosts. Now, if you don't know, William or Bill Castle was known as the king of gimmicks in Hollywood. He was responsible either as director, producer, or both for films like House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, Homicidal, Mr. Sardonicus, and many more, including the aforementioned 13 Ghosts. Now, I'm not going to list all the various gimmicks employed by Castle to get people into the movie theater, but some of his most famous ones include having a skeleton on a string fly through the theater during the climax of House on Haunted Hill, or putting buzzers in the movie theater seats for The Tingler, a film about a parasite that attaches itself to your spine, and the only way you can get rid of it is to scream. But one of his most interesting gimmicks, at least to me, was his gimmick for 13 Ghosts. In the film, viewers got to choose whether or not they got to see the ghosts through a process called illusiono. Gotta love these old gimmicky names. Everything in the film, except the ghosts, were filmed using a blue filter, while the ghosts were filmed with a red filter and superimposed onto the frame. Using a special looking device, viewers could choose to look through the red filter to see the ghosts, or look through the blue filter to remove them if they were too afraid. I actually got my hands on a replica Illusiono ghost viewer through eBay, and you can find them through a seller for around $9. So I bought a couple and I used them to view Choices. But being that not many people have 3D glasses, and even less people have Illusiono, I opted for the viewers to use the 3D glasses method of covering or closing one eye to view either the red or blue story. I even sort of have kind of my Bill Castle moment in the beginning where I'm explaining the gimmick to the audience. Not saying I'm anywhere near as good as Bill Castle or Alfred Hitchcock. I'm just saying I sort of have that moment where I explain the gimmick in the beginning of the film. I've come to notice that I really like gimmicks. Fragments was a film that was actually told in fragments. The Shadow Man trilogy were a series of films that each explored a different genre of horror that, when combined with new and additional footage, became an anthology horror film. And then, of course, we have Choices, with the gimmick being the anaglyph system. So yeah, I don't know. I guess they just always appealed to me. So the idea of the opening where the three amateur scientists are doing a backyard version of Schrodinger's cat actually came to me when I was helping my friend Chris come up with an idea for his film. He contacted me one day and asked what film ideas I could come up with that involved a trailer and a small dog, two things he had access to at the time. And I wrote down this idea of amateur scientists doing a version of Schrodinger's cat where they create a nexus point in reality, and by coexisting in two realities simultaneously, they cause problems for themselves. This was partly inspired by one of my favorite shows, Dark, which is on Netflix. If you want to know more about Schrodinger's cat, I would suggest Googling it because I'm sure there are a lot of people who are much smarter than I am who can explain it better than me. Chris eventually ended up going with his own comedic idea that became The Bachelor Party, which I ended up helping out on as DP. You can check out his film in the description below. But I always kept that idea of three scientists in the back of my head. And being that I already had the idea of doing an anaglyph film before that, I thought the amateur scientists creating two realities was perfect for Choices. So I made it sort of a cold open to the film. Chris also stars in Choices as one of the scientists and also the co-star of the Anaglyph Red and Blue segments. I met Will through another one of Chris's films where he gave a memorable performance and I immediately knew I wanted to work with him. He also stars in Chris's Bachelor Party. And making his short film return is the one and only Nick, who hasn't been in a short film of mine since Colors 2. And during the Anaglyph segment, Kayla came in and played the main girl co-starring with Chris as a couple that both falls apart and comes together. My original idea was to follow a breakup and then each lens would focus on either the boy or girl's perspective in dealing with the breakup. I eventually asked Chris for help and together we wrote some ideas down. Eventually, I came up with the idea of still starting with the breakup, but instead of following each of their perspectives, we follow the character's choice to either run back to his girlfriend or move on. So in one story, he chooses to run back to her, which is the wrong choice, and even though they are happy for a while, the relationship ends up falling apart. And in the other storyline, he chooses not to go back, but every time he touches something she touched, like his cross, he gets a vision of where she is at, and then in the end, they end up together. Shooting did have its challenges, as it was basically like shooting 3 films in one, so keeping track of everything was a bit of a challenge, and it's actually funny because initially, Kayla and Chris had a change of clothes, but we forgot them at my house when we drove to the park. We carpooled to the park, so the result is that everything in the film looks like it happens in one day. And it's kind of funny, though, because in the blue side of the film, it looks like Chris goes from the park to the toy store, back to the park, but that's okay, we just made do. But speaking of, we filmed in an awesome toy store called Sarge and Red's in Utica, Michigan. You can check them out in the description as well. They were super nice and have the best vintage and modern toy collection in Michigan. On a technical note, I shot this with my Panasonic GH5S and I edited it with Adobe Premiere using the obsolete color balance effect. The music came from Epidemic Sound, while the production audio for the beginning segment was recorded by my friend Jordan Beckett. His info will also be in the description. Editing the film also had its challenges, as the anaglyph process worked perfectly in the editor, but when exported, the blue side becomes slightly visible through the red side. I tried a myriad of options to fix this, and came to the conclusion that it just depends what you view it on. If you view it on YouTube or QuickTime, there is ghosting, but on VLC or an editor, there is no ghosting. I eventually just cut my losses and said that even though the ghosting is there through the red lens, it isn't really enough to break full immersion. Anaglyph art is nothing new. There have been artists that have utilized this technique for things like artwork and wall murals, so I took inspiration from that as well. It was a combination of inspiration that led to Choices. 13 Ghosts inspired the anaglyph process, shows like Dark influenced the Backyard segment, and the idea of having a sad and happy ending that the viewer can choose between stems all the way back to 1922's The Power of Love. So I hope you enjoyed this behind the scenes where I break down some 3D history and talk about my inspirations in coming up with this idea. Only half the film is anaglyph, but maybe in the future I'll do a full short film with this technique. Let me know if you want that in the comments below. Be sure to watch Choices linked in the description and have a great day. See you guys.